Hi everyone, and welcome to this video where I did a small comparison study on the Clairefontaine Pastelmat, Pastelgrain and the Canson Velvet papers. Now I started off by choosing a similar colour, so I went for the dark grey in the Pastelmat and the Pastelgrain, and Moonstone for the Canson Velvet. The Moonstone was the closest match that I could find to the dark grey, although it is a little bit lighter. My goal was to see how each of these papers performed under the same conditions, so I was focusing on blending, layering and just the overall texture. Now I drew just a basic dog eye on each piece of paper. Nothing fancy, just a simple study just to get a feel for how the pastels worked on each of the surface. But I definitely will need to explore these papers more by doing a full subject on each, I think. I noticed that the Pastelmat and the Pastelgrain and the dark grey are very similar in texture, not only to the touch but also to the naked eye. But under the lights in my studio, the Pastelgrain did have a slightly darker appearance, and that may have been that the extra grain in the paper was affecting the way it reflected the light. And the Canson Velvet definitely had a softer feel to it. So I used the Stabilo Carbothellos in this study, and once I started laying down the pastel, the differences between the papers became more noticeable. The velvet, as I mentioned, felt a lot softer, almost sort of luxurious and fluffy. And when I applied the pastel, it had a smoothness that was immediately satisfying. But I did find that it didn't grip the pastel quite as firmly as the other two papers. Now, on the other hand, the Pastelmat gave me that familiar texture that I'm used to, which is great for layering, but requires a bit more effort in the blending. And the Pastelgrain was just somewhere in between. It offered a softer feel than the Pastelmat, but it still gripped the pastel really well. When it came to the blending, the Pastelgrain really stood out. The colours just seemed to melt into each other with very little effort, creating a really soft and seamless look. And the velvet also blended beautifully, but it had a slightly different finish, less grainy than the Pastelmat, but not as soft as the Pastelgrain. Now, meanwhile, blending on the Pastelmat took a little bit more work, and I found myself needing to layer more of the pastel to achieve the same smoothness that I got on the other two papers. One thing I noticed with Pastelgrain was how quickly it built up rich, vibrant colours. It didn't need as many layers to get the effect that I wanted, which made the process feel quicker and more efficient. However, it did produce a bit more pastel dust compared to the other two papers, and my concern would be that the grainier texture would wear down my pencils faster over time. With the Canson Velvet, I loved how clean and polished the results looked, especially in areas with fine details. The smoothness of the paper kept the lines a bit crisper, but because it didn't hold as much pigment as the other two, I did have to adjust my technique slightly just to build up the depth that I wanted. So towards the end of the test, I decided to add just some lighter colours and highlights just to see how they would stand out on each paper. On the Pastelgrain, the lighter tones popped beautifully and they blended into the paper without losing their brightness. The velvet also handled the highlights well, but I did notice it created a slightly smoother, softer transition compared to the Pastelmat, which maintained a more grainy appearance in this test anyway. The Pastelmat, which is my go-to paper, would just need a bit more work to achieve that same softness. So after working on all three papers, I realised just how much the paper choice can influence the overall look and feel of a piece. The Pastelmat is solid and dependable. It's perfect for detailed work and lots of layering, and like I said, it's been my paper of choice since I started drawing. The Pastelgrain, with its softer texture and easy blending, gave me a polished professional look but with less effort. and the velvet was smooth and refined, and that offered clean results but required a bit more attention just to build up the pigment. If I had to rank them based on this little test alone, then the Pastelgrain would come out on top, just for its softness and blending capabilities. The velvet would take second for its smooth, sort of professional finish, and surprisingly for me, the Pastelmat, which still is a fantastic choice, would come in third, and that's due just to its slightly more labour-intensive blending process. Now that said, each paper has its strengths, and the best choice depends, of course, on the project and your personal preferences. This little experiment reminded me that there's no one-size-fits-all when it comes to pastel papers. Each one has its own character, and it's worth experimenting to find what works best for your style and the effect that you're wanting to achieve. I would definitely lean toward the Pastelgrain and the Canson Velvet if I was looking for a softer look to my drawings, and I think both of these papers would be excellent for backgrounds or landscapes, just due to their lovely blending capabilities. Until I do some larger studies, I'm still on the fence, and certainly wouldn't tell you to rush out and buy these new papers if you're content with your Pastelmat. But if you get a chance to try them, then why not? After all, that's the beauty of being an artist. You get to experiment with different materials, and you get to decide which ones suit your purpose the best. So until next time, happy pasteling.